Some stories stick with you forever, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me when I was still wearing the badge. I'm Detective Mike Sullivan, retired now at 68, and in my 35 years on the force, I thought I'd seen everything. But this one case, this one night, it changed everything I thought I knew about human nature and the thin line between justice and revenge. It was a cold November evening in 2018. Just 2 years before I hung up my badge for good. I was working the late shift, cruising through the quieter parts of downtown when dispatch crackled through my radio. Domestic disturbance call, nothing unusual there. These calls were bread and butter for a detective like me, though at my age, I was hoping for quieter nights leading up to retirement. The address led me to a rundown apartment complex on the east side of town. You know the type: peeling paint, broken streetlights, and the kind of silence that makes you check your weapon twice before stepping out of the car. I'd been to this complex before, more times than I cared to count. Drug busts, domestic violence, the occasional robbery. It was the kind of place where hope went to die. But as I walked up those creaking stairs to apartment 3B, something felt different. The usual sounds of televisions blaring and neighbors arguing were absent. Instead, there was an eerie quiet that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. After 3.5 decades on the force, you develop a sixth sense about these things. Something was very wrong. I knocked on the door, identifying myself as police. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. That's when I noticed the door was slightly ajar. In my experience, that's never a good sign. I drew my weapon and pushed the door open slowly, calling out as I entered. The apartment was small, cramped, and smelled of stale cigarettes and something else I couldn't quite place. The living room was a mess, furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere. It looked like a struggle had taken place. I moved carefully through the space, checking corners, listening for any sound that might indicate where the occupants were. That's when I heard it, a soft whimpering coming from the bedroom. I approached cautiously, my heart rate picking up despite all my years of experience. You never get used to not knowing what you're walking into. The bedroom door was closed, and I could hear movement inside. I positioned myself beside the door and called out again, identifying myself as police and asking whoever was inside to come out with their hands visible. The whimpering stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then slowly, the door creaked open. What I saw next is burned into my memory forever. A young woman, maybe 25 years old, emerged from the bedroom. She was disheveled, her clothes torn, and she had bruises on her arms and face. But it wasn't her condition that shocked me. It was what she was dragging behind her. A man, unconscious and bound with electrical cord, was being pulled across the floor by this woman who couldn't have weighed more than 110 pounds soaking wet. The man was easily twice her size, and yet somehow she had managed to subdue him completely. I immediately holstered my weapon and approached carefully. The woman looked up at me with eyes that held a mixture of fear and determination I'd never seen before. She didn't try to run. She didn't try to hide what she was doing. She just looked at me and said, "Officer, I need to tell you something. Now, in 35 years of police work, I've heard every story, every excuse, every justification for violence you can imagine. But something about this woman's demeanor told me this was different. She wasn't acting like a criminal. She was acting like someone who had been pushed to the very edge of what a human being could endure." I secured the scene and called for backup and an ambulance. The man was alive but unconscious, and I could smell alcohol on his breath from across the room. As we waited for backup to arrive, the woman, who told me her name was Sarah, began to tell me her story. She had been married to this man, David, for 3 years. What started as a loving relationship had gradually turned into a nightmare of psychological and physical abuse. David was an alcoholic who lost his job 6 months earlier and had been taking his frustrations out on Sarah with increasing violence. Sarah showed me photographs on her phone, pictures she had been secretly taking of her injuries over the months, bruises, cuts, even a broken wrist that David had claimed was an accident. She had been building a case, she said, waiting for the right moment to escape. But what happened that night was different. David had come home drunk, angrier than she'd ever seen him. He had threatened not just to hurt her, but to kill her. He had grabbed a knife from the kitchen and cornered her in the bedroom. Sarah was convinced she was going to die that night. What she told me next was where the story took an unexpected turn. Sarah had been taking self-defense classes in secret for months, paying for them with money she had been hiding from David. She had been preparing for this moment, the moment when she would have to fight for her life. When David lunged at her with the knife, Sarah's training kicked in. She managed to disarm him, and in the struggle, David fell and hit his head on the corner of the dresser. He was knocked unconscious, and Sarah, thinking he might wake up and try to kill her again, had bound him with electrical cord. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Sarah didn't call the police immediately. Instead, she sat there for hours, looking at her unconscious husband, debating what to do. She told me she had thought about just leaving, walking away and never looking back. But she also thought about all the other women who might end up in her situation with David. So she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Sarah decided to wait and call the police herself. She wanted to make sure David was arrested and that there was a clear record of what had happened. She wanted to break the cycle of violence, not just for herself, but for any future victims. When backup arrived, we arrested David on charges of domestic violence and assault with a deadly weapon. Sarah was taken to the hospital to be treated for her injuries and to have them documented for the legal case. I thought that was the end of the story, but I was wrong. Over the next few weeks, as the case progressed through the legal system, I stayed in touch with Sarah. She had moved in with her sister and was working with a victim's advocate to rebuild her life. David, meanwhile, was facing serious charges and the possibility of years in prison. But then something unexpected happened. Sarah came to see me at the station. She wanted to talk about the case, about David, about what had happened that night. She told me something that made me question everything I thought I knew about justice and redemption. During those hours, she had sat with David unconscious on the floor. Sarah had gone through his belongings. She found things that shocked her, letters from other women, women who had been in relationships with David before her, letters describing the same pattern of abuse, the same escalating violence, the same fear for their lives. Sarah realized that she wasn't David's first victim. She was just the latest in a long line of women who had suffered at his hands. Some of the letters were from women who had tried to leave, who had pressed charges, who had sought help. But somehow, David had always managed to talk his way out of serious consequences. This revelation changed everything for Sarah. She was no longer just a victim defending herself. She was a woman who had stopped a predator, potentially saving future victims from the same fate she had endured. But the most shocking part of Sarah's visit was what she told me next. She had been contacted by one of David's previous victims, a woman named Maria, who had seen the news coverage of David's arrest. Maria wanted to thank Sarah for what she had done, for finally holding David accountable. Maria told Sarah that she had tried to press charges against David 2 years earlier, but David had convinced the judge that he was a changed man, that he was seeking help for his drinking problem, that he would never hurt anyone again. He received probation and mandatory counseling, which he completed successfully. But Maria knew better. She had stayed in contact with other women in David's past, and she knew that the pattern continued. David would find a new victim, start the cycle over again, and use his previous successful completion of court-ordered programs as evidence of his rehabilitation. Sarah's case was different because she had documented everything. She had photographs, medical records, and most importantly, she had defended herself successfully. There was no question about David's guilt, no room for manipulation or false promises of reform. The trial was swift and decisive. David was sentenced to 15 years in prison with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. It was the longest sentence ever given for domestic violence in our county, and it sent a clear message that the cycle of abuse would not be tolerated. But the story doesn't end there. Sarah used her experience to become an advocate for other domestic violence victims. She started a support group for women who had been in abusive relationships. teaching them self-defense techniques and helping them document abuse for potential legal action. She also worked with the district attorney's office to develop better protocols for handling domestic violence cases, ensuring that patterns of abuse across multiple relationships were properly investigated and prosecuted. 5 years later, Sarah's organization had helped over 200 women escape abusive relationships and had contributed to the conviction of dozens of repeat offenders. She had turned her trauma into a mission to protect others. As for David, he served his full sentence. I kept tabs on him through the system, and I'm happy to report that he never had another opportunity to hurt anyone. He died in prison in 2023, 5 years into his sentence, from complications related to his alcoholism. Some might say that's a sad ending, but I've seen too many cases where abusers get second chances they don't deserve, where they use the system's mercy to find new victims. David's story ended the way it needed to end. What struck me most about this case was how it challenged my assumptions about justice. For 35 years, I had believed in the system, in the idea that everyone deserves a fair trial and a second chance. But Sarah's case showed me that sometimes the system fails the most vulnerable among us. Sarah didn't just defend herself that night, she defended every woman who might have become David's next victim. She broke a cycle of violence that had been continuing for years, and she did it with courage and intelligence that still amazes me. The case also taught me about the importance of documentation and preparation. Sarah's secret self-defense training and her careful documentation of abuse were what made the difference between becoming another statistic and becoming a survivor who could help others. I retired 2 years after Sarah's case, but it remains the most significant case of my career, not because of the violence or the drama, but because of what it taught me about the resilience of the human spirit and the power of one person to change the trajectory of not just their own life, but the lives of others. Sarah still sends me Christmas cards every year. She's married now to a man who respects and supports her advocacy work. She has 2 children and a life filled with purpose and meaning. She took the worst thing that ever happened to her and turned it into a force for good in the world. That's the thing about being a detective for 35 years. You see the worst of humanity on a regular basis. You see people at their lowest points, making their worst decisions, hurting the people they're supposed to love. It can make you cynical, make you lose faith in human nature. But then you meet someone like Sarah, someone who faced the darkness and chose to light a candle instead of cursing it, someone who took their pain and turned it into purpose, someone who proved that even in the worst circumstances, people can choose to be heroes. I think about Sarah's case often, especially now in retirement. It reminds me that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about prevention. Sometimes it's about breaking cycles. Sometimes it's about giving people the tools they need to protect themselves and others. The case also reinforced my belief in the importance of training and preparation. Sarah's self-defense classes saved her life, but more than that, they gave her the confidence to take control of her situation. They turned her from a victim into a survivor, and eventually into a protector of others. As I look back on my career, I realize that cases like Sarah's are why I became a police officer in the first place, not for the excitement or the authority, but for the opportunity to help people, to make a difference, to be part of the solution to society's problems. Sarah's story is a reminder that heroism doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it's a 110-pound woman who decides she's had enough. Sometimes it's someone who chooses to stand up not just for themselves, but for all the people who might need protection in the future. That November night in 2018 started like any other domestic disturbance call, but it ended with a lesson that changed how I think about justice, courage, and the power of one person to change the world. It reminded me that even after 35 years on the force, there are still stories that can surprise you, still people who can restore your faith in humanity. Sarah's case will always be special to me because it showed me that sometimes the best thing that can happen is when someone decides they're not going to be a victim anymore, when they choose to fight back, not just for themselves, but for everyone who comes after them. That's the kind of story that makes a career in law enforcement worthwhile. That's the kind of person who reminds you why you put on the badge in the first place. That's the kind of case that stays with you long after you've turned in your gun and walked away from the job. And that's why, even 5 years into retirement, I still think about Sarah and that November night when a domestic disturbance call turned into a lesson about courage, justice, and the power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest circumstances.